The gleaming corridors of Trading Station 42 had never felt so dangerous to Queen Silver. Her crystalline wings trembled slightly as she hurried through the maintenance tunnels, the sound of heavy boots echoing somewhere behind her. 3 days had passed since she'd fled her hive, escaping just hours before her cousin's forces could capture her. Now, exhausted and alone, she found herself in the depths of a human-built space station, running out of places to hide. She pressed herself against a cold metal wall as another patrol passed nearby. The guards wore the colors of her hive, but she knew they served her cousin now. It still felt unreal. The betrayal, the carefully planned coup, the way decades of peace had shattered in a single night. Her antenna twitched as she picked up traces of weapon oil and sweat. The hunters were getting closer. The station's dim emergency lighting cast strange shadows through her transparent wings, creating shifting patterns on the walls. She needed to reach the civilian docks on the upper levels, where a loyal trader had promised to hide her aboard their ship. But with enemy patrols blocking the main corridors, she had been forced deeper into the station's maintenance areas. A sudden clang of metal made her jump. She spun around, her heart racing, only to find an automated cleaning drone bumping against a pipe. The brief moment of relief vanished as voices echoed from around the corner. More patrols. And this time they were too close. Queen Silver looked frantically for an escape route, but found only sealed maintenance hatches and dead ends. "This way," a rough voice called out. The sensors picked up movement. The Queen's legs felt weak. She had never trained for combat, had never needed to, surrounded by loyal guards her whole life. Now those same guards hunted her, and she had no idea how to fight back. She backed away from the approaching footsteps until she hit a locked door, her wings scraping against the metal. The first guard appeared at the end of the corridor, weapon raised. Others quickly joined him, their black armor marked with the crystal insignia of her hive. She recognized the leader, Commander Rust, once one of her most trusted officers. His antenna shifted forward aggressively as he approached. "My queen," he said, managing to make her title sound like an insult. "Your cousin sends his regards. He wanted us to ensure you reached home safely." The other guards chuckled, their weapons never wavering from their target. Queen Silver straightened her back, summoning what dignity she could. "You dishonor our hive with this treachery, Commander. Stand down, and there may still be forgiveness." Rust laughed. "Forgiveness? The old ways are done. Your cousin understands what you never did. Our hive needs strength, not your weak diplomatic approaches. The galaxy is changing, and we must change with it. By betraying everything we stand for," the Queen demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. "By doing what must be done," Rust replied coldly. He raised his weapon. "Now you will come with us quietly, or—" The commander never finished his sentence. A massive figure dropped from a maintenance shaft above, landing directly behind the guards. Before they could react, the figure grabbed two of them and slammed their heads together with shocking force. As they crumpled, the others spun to face the new threat, but they were too slow. The Queen watched in amazement as their attacker moved with impossible speed. He was human, she realized, nearly twice her height, wearing a simple station security uniform. He fought with a brutal efficiency she had never seen before, disarming one guard and using him as a shield against another's shots. Energy bolts sparked off the walls as the human closed the distance, his movements precise and devastating. Commander Rust managed to fire 3 shots, but the human seemed to anticipate them, rolling forward under the blasts. He came up inside the commander's guard and struck with an armored fist, crushing through the officer's protective plating. Rust went down hard, his weapon clattering across the floor. In less than 30 seconds, all 5 guards lay unconscious or groaning on the deck. The human stood among them, breathing slightly heavily but otherwise appearing unharmed. He turned to face the Queen, and she saw his features clearly for the first time. Weather-worn skin, close-cropped gray hair, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Station security," he said simply. Looks like you could use some help, Mom. Queen Silver's antenna quivered as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. She had seen combat footage of humans before, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of their capabilities. Yes. Thank you. I am in your debt, human. Name's James, he replied, already checking the corridor for more threats. And we should move. More will be coming soon. He knelt to check Commander Rust's vital signs, ensuring the officer was alive but securely unconscious. I am Queen Silver of the Crystal Hive, she said, following as he led her quickly down the corridor. Though I fear that title means little now. James glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. Caught that part from their conversation. Coop. When she nodded, he continued, got a safe place to go. The civilian docks, she replied. There is a traitor there who. Compromised, James cut in. Saw your cousin's forces checking ships up there an hour ago. They'll have found any sympathizers by now. He paused at an intersection, checking both directions before proceeding. I've got a better option. Security office on level 12 has a panic room. Not on any official station plans. We can hole up there, figure out next steps. The Queen hesitated only briefly before following. This human had already saved her life, and something in his calm professionalism inspired trust. They moved quickly through the maintenance areas, James choosing routes that avoided the main corridors and security cameras. He seemed to know every hidden path and maintenance shaft in the station. You seem very experienced at this, she observed as they climbed through a narrow access tunnel. James helped her up a difficult section before responding. Used to do this kind of work, before station security. He didn't elaborate, but his efficient movements and combat skills told their own story. They reached the security office without incident. James sealed the door behind them and activated a series of controls that the Queen didn't recognize. Scrambling sensors, he explained. As far as station systems can tell, this room is empty. The panic room proved to be a small but well-equipped space, hidden behind a false wall. It had basic medical supplies, food, water, and most importantly, secure communications equipment. As soon as they were safely inside, James began checking the Queen for injuries. Why? She asked suddenly. When he looked up questioningly, she continued, Why help me? You don't know me or my situation. This could bring terrible trouble to you. James was quiet for a moment as he finished his check. Finally, he sat back and met her gaze. Saw the whole thing start 3 days ago. Your cousin's forces taking control, loyal guards being replaced. Watched them hunting you through the station. Reminded me of something I saw once, back when I was in Special Forces. Different planet, different species, same story. Stood by and followed orders that time. His jaw tightened. Watched good people died because no one stepped up. Not doing that again. Queen Silver studied him, seeing the pain of old memories in his expression. You were a warrior of your people. Was. He agreed. Retired now. Came out here looking for quiet. But some things you can't walk away from. He stood and checked the monitors he had set up. Got about 6 hours before they changed patrol patterns. Need to move you before then. Got some ideas about that, if you're willing to trust me a bit longer. The Queen straightened, her wings catching the low light. You have more than earned my trust, James of Earth. I accept your help, and I swear by the Crystal Throne that this debt will be repaid. James shook his head slightly. No debt. Just doing what needs doing. He turned back to the monitors, but not before the Queen caught the ghost of a smile. Now let me tell you about this plan. You're not going to like parts of it, but it'll work. Used something similar back on Titan. As James outlined his strategy, Queen Silver found herself fascinated by this complex creature who had appointed himself her protector. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, and much about them remained mysterious. But watching James work, seeing how his mind approached problems from angles her people would never consider, she began to understand why humans had adapted so quickly to life among the stars. She had lost her throne, her home, and nearly her life in the past 3 days. But as she listened to James explain his audacious plan for getting her to safety, Queen Silver felt something she had not expected: hope. 3 weeks had passed since their escape from Trading Station 42, and Queen Silver watched with growing amazement as James transformed her remaining loyal guards into something entirely new. They had found refuge on a small mining moon, hiding among the endless maze of abandoned tunnels and old processing facilities. The human had turned the forgotten industrial site into both fortress and training ground. Right now, he was teaching a group of her guards something he called small unit tactics. The Queen observed from a higher platform as James demonstrated how to move through tight spaces as a team. Her warriors had always trained in large organized formations, but James insisted that smaller, more flexible groups would be their key to survival. "You're thinking like a big army," he told them, his voice echoing in the metal chamber. "But we're not a big army. We're the ghost in the machine, the knife in the dark. Hit fast, hit hard, then vanish before they can respond." One of her guards, a veteran named Stone, stepped forward. "But this feels wrong. We are warriors of the Crystal Hive. We should face our enemies directly, with honor." James picked up a piece of scrap metal and held it up. "Honor is good. Being dead is bad. Your enemies already threw away honor when they betrayed your queen. We're fighting to survive, to make things right. That means using every advantage we can get." The Queen's antenna twitched as she sensed someone approaching. It was Leaf, one of her youngest guards and now their best scout. The young warrior bowed quickly before speaking. "My queen, the communication intercepts are ready." James asked to be notified immediately. They made their way to the command center, a converted mining office filled with salvaged equipment. James had somehow modified the old mining sensors into a surprisingly effective intelligence network. The human was already there when they arrived, studying data streams on multiple screens. "It's worse than we thought," he said without looking up. "Your cousin isn't just consolidating power in your hive. He's making deals with the Steel Hive, trading mining rights for military support. He's building an army." Queen Silver felt her wings droop slightly. The Steel Hive was known for its aggressive expansion and military might. If they were involved, the situation was even more dire than she had feared. "Then we have already lost. We cannot stand against two hives." James finally turned to face her, and she saw that familiar look of determination in his eyes. "Numbers aren't everything. During the Mars Rebellion, I saw 200 troops hold off an army of thousands for 3 months. Not because they were stronger, but because they were smarter." He pointed to the screens. "Your cousin is thinking like a traditional hive commander. Big forces, direct confrontation. We'll use that against him." He walked to a large digital map of the sector. "Look here. The Steel Hide forces have to travel through this asteroid belt to reach your territory. Lots of mineral interference, limited scanning capability. Perfect place for a small force to cause big problems." As James outlined his strategy, the Queen found herself drawn into his way of thinking. He showed them how to use the terrain to their advantage, how to strike at supply lines instead of armies, how to make the enemy waste resources chasing shadows. It was unlike anything taught in the military academies of her hive, yet she could see the deadly logic behind it. Later that night, after the others had retired, Queen Silver found James alone in the command center. He was cleaning an old projectile weapon. A rifle, he called it. She had learned that he preferred these simple but reliable human weapons to the more advanced energy weapons her people used. "Why do you stay?" she asked suddenly. "You have done more than enough to repay any debt of honor. This is not your fight." James was quiet for a long moment, his hands continuing their practiced movement with the weapon. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with memory. 5 years ago, I was leading a special forces team on a mining colony called New Eden. Corporate war, messy business. We were supposed to protect civilian workers from raiders, had the training, the equipment, everything we needed. He paused, checking the rifle's mechanism. But we followed standard procedures, set up defensive positions just like the manual said. Raiders hit us from an angle we never expected. Lost half my team in the first hour. Civilians too. He looked up at her, his eyes haunted. I followed orders, did everything by the book. And I failed those people. Been carrying that ever since. Standing up, he walked to the map display. But this time is different. This time, I'm going to do it right. Your people deserve better than to live under a tyrant who'd killed his own family for power. The queen moved to stand beside him, her crystalline form reflecting the dim light. You make it sound so simple. A matter of right and wrong. Sometimes it is, James replied. Sometimes you have to draw a line and say this far, no further. Your cousin crossed that line when he tried to have you killed. Question is, what are we going to do about it? Before she could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the base. Leaf burst into the command center, breathing hard. Enemy patrol. They must have detected something. 3 ships, heading this way. James was already moving, grabbing his rifle and checking the screens. Too soon, he muttered. We're not ready yet. How long? 20 minutes at most, Leaf reported. The Queen watched as James's expression shifted from concern to focused determination. Right, time for the backup plan. He turned to her guards who were now rushing into the command center. Remember the evacuation drill we practiced? This is it. Stone, take Team 2 and prep the decoys. Leaf, start the data wipe. Everything by the numbers, just like we trained. Queen Silver was amazed at how quickly her warriors responded to his commands. Just weeks ago, they would have been paralyzed by such a crisis. Now they moved with purpose, each knowing their role in the carefully prepared escape plan. James turned to her. My queen, we need to move you to the secondary site. The tunnels under the old processing plant. No, she interrupted firmly. I will not hide while others risk their lives for me. Not again. For a moment, she thought he would argue. Instead, he nodded slowly. All right, but you stay close to me, and you do exactly what I say. Deal. She straightened to her full height, her wings spreading slightly. Deal. The next 20 minutes were a blur of activity. James had prepared for this possibility with typical human thoroughness. Decoy signals were activated, false trails laid, and vital equipment quickly moved through hidden tunnels. By the time the enemy ships arrived, the base appeared to have been abandoned for days. From their hiding place in a reinforced observation post, Queen Silver watched with her guards as the patrol ships landed. Teams of soldiers spread out, weapons ready, searching the facility. They found exactly what James had planned for them to find: old supply crates, deactivated equipment, and carefully crafted evidence suggesting the base had been a temporary waypoint, abandoned once it served its purpose. Hours later, when the patrol had finally left, convinced they had found another dead end, the Queen turned to James. You knew this would happen. He nodded, still watching the ships disappear into the distance. Sooner or later, they were going to get lucky. Had to be ready. He checked something on a small device he carried. They'll be back with a bigger force, do a more thorough search, but by then, we'll be long gone. He looked at her with a slight smile. And we'll have left them a few surprises. Queen Silver realized that even this seeming setback was part of his strategy, another layer in his complex plan. You truly are remarkable, James of Earth. My people owe you a great debt. He shook his head, already moving to help with the equipment recovery. No debt, just a promise to do better this time. He paused, looking back at her. Besides, your guards are learning fast. Give them a few more weeks, and they'll be ready to show your cousin exactly what a small, determined force can do. As they worked to restore their hidden base, Queen Silver reflected on how much had changed in just 3 weeks. James had not only given them hope, he had given them a new way of thinking, of fighting, of surviving. And watching him work, she began to understand that this was about more than strategy or tactics. It was about transformation, about becoming something their enemies could never expect or understand. The war for her hive was just beginning, but for the first time, she truly believed they might win it. The explosion lit up the night sky as another supply convoy went up in flames. From their hidden position in the hills, James watched through binoculars as confusion spread through the enemy ranks. 3 months of constant raids had taken their toll on the rebel forces, and their responses were becoming increasingly desperate. "Right on schedule," he murmured, checking his watch. Beside him, Stone readied the signal beacon. In the valley below, the convoy guards were spreading out to secure the area, exactly as they had been trained to do, exactly as James had predicted they would do. "Now," James commanded softly. Stone activated the beacon, and within seconds, the real attack began. Queen Silver's loyal guards emerged from hidden positions around the valley, moving in the precise patterns James had drilled into them for weeks. They struck from multiple directions, using the darkness and chaos to their advantage. The convoy guards, already rattled by the explosion, found themselves fighting shadows. James had equipped the strike team with simple but effective smoke generators and modified their crystal armor to absorb enemy scanning signals. To their targets, they appeared as little more than blurs in the darkness. "Beautiful," James said, watching his students put their training into action. "They're finally getting it." The raid was over in less than 5 minutes. The convoy was destroyed. The guards were retreating in disorder, and his team was already disappearing back into the night, leaving behind more fear and uncertainty in the enemy ranks. Back at their new base, a sprawling network of caves deep in the Crystal Mountains, Queen Silver was waiting for their return. James had noticed how she had changed over the past months, becoming more involved in the tactical planning, learning to think like a guerrilla commander rather than a traditional ruler. "The Steel Hive representatives are furious," she told him as the team unloaded their captured supplies. "They're demanding that my cousin commit more forces to convoy protection. Their mining operations are falling behind schedule." James grinned as he checked over the captured weapons. "Good. The more resources they waste chasing us, the fewer they have for actual fighting. How's our other project coming along?" The Queen's antenna twitched with what he had learned was amusement. "The propaganda broadcasts are having the desired effect. More workers are sabotaging equipment in the mines. 3 outposts reported communications problems last week. The common people haven't forgotten their true queen." "Speaking of communications," a voice called out. Leaf emerged from the command center, holding a datapad. "We just intercepted some interesting transmissions. The Steel Hive is pulling back forces from 2 forward bases. They're claiming equipment malfunctions, but they're really scared," James finished. "They came here expecting an easy victory, quick profits. Instead, they're losing ships, supplies, and face. Their warriors aren't trained for this kind of fight." He turned to the Queen. "It's time for the next phase. Are your people ready?" Queen Silver nodded. "The underground network is in place. When we give the signal, workers in every major facility will rise up. But the timing must be perfect." "It will be," James assured her. "Your cousin's forces are spread thin trying to protect everything at once. The Steel Hive is getting nervous. One more push and—" He was interrupted by urgent shouts from the command center. Stone rushed out, his normally calm demeanor shaken. "James, my queen, we have a problem. The beta site, it's under attack." They knew exactly where to hit us. James was moving before Stone finished speaking. In the command center, the screen showed live feeds from their secondary base. Enemy forces had surrounded the facility, using exactly the kind of precision strikes that James had taught Queen Silver's forces. "They're using our own tactics," the Queen said quietly. "How is this possible?" James studied the footage, his expression grim. "Because someone told them. We have a traitor." He turned to face the assembled guards. "Someone who knows our methods, our hiding places. Someone who's been watching and learning." The revelation sent a shock through the group. These warriors had fought together, bled together, become a family. The idea that one of them could betray their cause seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was clear on the screens before them. The beta site held our largest cache of supplies, Stone said. Medical equipment, weapons, food, everything we'd need for the final push. James was already checking weapons and gear. How many of our people were there? 12 guards, 20 support staff, Leaf reported. Most of them newly recruited from the civilian underground. I'm going, the Queen declared before James could speak. Those people are there because they believed in our cause. I will not abandon them. James wanted to argue, but he saw the determination in her stance. She was no longer the frightened ruler he had rescued from the trading station. She had become a true leader, willing to risk everything for her people. We'll take the fast transport, he said instead. Stone, you're with us. Leaf, coordinate from here and keep monitoring enemy communications. The rest of you, prepare for emergency evacuation. If we're not back in 3 hours, assume the worst and implement Protocol Ghost. As they hurried to the transport, James's mind was already racing through possibilities. The enemy would expect a rescue attempt. The trap wasn't just for the beta site, but for anyone who came to help. They would need to do something completely unexpected. You have a plan, the Queen said as they boarded the transport. It wasn't a question. Something like that, James replied, powering up the engines. Ever heard of a human tactic called hiding in plain sight? The rescue operation that followed would be talked about in whispers throughout the hive for years to come. James flew their transport directly toward the enemy forces, broadcasting corrupted identification codes that made them appear to be part of the attack force. In the confusion of battle, with dozens of ships moving in and out of the area, they slipped through the enemy lines. While the rebel forces focused on containing the beta site, James landed their transport in what appeared to be a suicidal position, right in the middle of enemy forces, but he had noticed something in the tactical displays that the others had missed. The enemy had positioned their forces to stop a rescue attempt from the outside. They weren't prepared for an attack from within their own lines. Time to make some noise, James said, activating a series of devices he had installed in the transport. Suddenly, alarms began blaring throughout the enemy position. Emergency signals indicated critical failures in multiple systems. Communication channels filled with static and false orders. In the chaos that followed, James led Queen Silver and Stone through the enemy formation. They moved with perfect coordination, using the rebels' own security protocols against them. When they reached the beta site, they found the defenders had not been idle. Following their training, they had prepared for exactly this kind of situation. The evacuation was completed in 20 minutes. By the time the enemy commanders realized what was happening, the beta site was empty, and their quarry had slipped away into the night. They had saved not only their people but most of their vital supplies as well. Later, back at the main base, as James helped coordinate the integration of the rescued personnel, Queen Silver approached him privately. "You knew about the traitor before today," she said. "It wasn't an accusation, merely an observation." James nodded slowly. Had suspicions, set up the beta site as a test, kept the really critical supplies elsewhere. He looked at her with tired eyes. "I've seen too many resistance movements torn apart from the inside. Had to know who we could trust before the final phase." The Queen's antenna moved thoughtfully. "And now? Now we know who the traitor is. They think their plan worked, that they've dealt us a major blow. That makes them predictable." A small smile crossed his face. "And in this kind of war, being predictable is deadly." Queen Silver studied the human who had become so much more than just her protector. "You are a constant surprise, James of Earth. Just when I think I understand your strategies, you reveal another layer." "That's the real lesson I wanted your people to learn," he replied. "Not just the tactics and techniques, but how to think differently, how to be unpredictable." He turned to face her fully. "The next few days will determine everything. Are you ready for what comes next?" The Queen's crystalline form seemed to glow with inner strength as she answered, "With you leading our forces, always." The command center hadn't been quiet for 3 days straight. James stood at the main tactical display, his eyes red from lack of sleep, watching as more enemy signals appeared across the screen. The rebel forces had finally launched their major offensive, and it was even bigger than he had expected. "That's the fourth wave today," Stone reported, his voice showing signs of exhaustion. "They're hitting every settlement, mining operation, and outpost that's shown any sign of supporting us. The civilian casualties." He trailed off, antenna drooping. James checked his rifle for the 100th time, a habit born from years of combat experience. "They're trying to force us into the open, make us choose between our hideouts and the people we're protecting." His jaw tightened, just like New Eden. Queen Silver watched him closely. She had learned to read human expressions over the past months, and she saw something in James's face that worried her, a shadow of old pain mixing with new determination. "Report from the eastern sector," Leaf called out, rushing into the command center. "The Steel Hive forces are pushing through the crystal canyons. They're using some kind of new scanning technology. Our smoke screens aren't working anymore." James moved to another screen, studying the tactical situation. 5 months of guerrilla warfare had taught their enemies harsh lessons. They had adapted, developed countermeasures, learned to think more creatively. Now they were applying that knowledge with overwhelming force. "How many civilians in the eastern settlements?" the Queen asked, though she already knew the answer. "Over 2,000, Stone replied. "Mostly miners and their families. They'd been smuggling us supplies, hiding our scouts. And now they'll pay the price for helping us," James said quietly. His hands clenched into fists. "Unless we stop it." The Queen moved closer to him. "James, I see what this is doing to you. These past 3 days, you've barely slept. You're pushing yourself beyond even human limits." "Can't sleep," he replied, checking another tactical display. "Too much to do, too many people counting on us." He turned to Stone. "Get strike teams 3 and 4 ready. We'll hit their forward elements here and here. Create a gap for the civilians to." "James," the Queen's sharp tone cut through his tactical focus. "Tell me about New Eden." The command center went quiet. Everyone had heard him mention New Eden before, but no one, not even the Queen, knew the full story. They watched as their human commander stood silent for a long moment, his expression haunted. Finally, he spoke. "It was supposed to be a simple protection mission. Mining colony, just like this. Corporate raiders hitting civilian targets." He moved to sit heavily in a chair, suddenly looking very tired. "My team was assigned to protect a group of settlements in the outer valleys. Good positions, solid defenses. By the book." He rubbed his face with one hand. "Raiders hit us at night. Not the main settlements we were protecting. They went after the smaller outposts first, places we thought weren't important enough to guard heavily. They killed everyone they found. Families, kids." His voice grew harder. "We had to choose. Stay and protect the main settlements, or try to save the outposts. We chose to stay put. Follow protocol." "What happened?" the Queen asked softly. "The outposts were just a distraction. Raiders used the chaos to slip past our defenses, hit us from inside our own lines. By the time we realized what was happening," he looked up at them, his eyes filled with old pain. "I followed the rules. Did everything by the book. And I listened to 2,000 people die because of it." Queen Silver's antenna moved thoughtfully. "And now you see the same pattern forming here. History repeating itself," James agreed. "But this time," he stood up suddenly, moving back to the tactical display. "This time we're going to write a different ending." "How?" Stone asked. "We're outnumbered at least 20 to 1. They have better equipment, air support, heavy weapons. They also have something else," James said, his energy returning as a plan formed. "They have expectations. They think they know how we'll react, because it's how anyone would react. Protect the civilians, defend our territory. A slight smile crossed his face. So let's do something no one would expect. For the next hour, James outlined his plan. It was audacious, possibly suicidal, and completely contrary to conventional military thinking. The Queen watched as her commander's expressions shifted from doubt to understanding and finally to determined acceptance. "It's crazy," Stone said finally. "It goes against everything we know about warfare." "Exactly," James replied. "That's why it'll work." He turned to the Queen. "But I won't do this without your approval. We're risking everything on one throw of the dice." Queen Silver stood straight, her crystalline form catching the light from the tactical displays. "You've taught us that sometimes the boldest move is the safest one. That doing the unexpected is our greatest weapon." She nodded firmly. "Do it." The next 12 hours tested them all to their limits, while the enemy pressed their offensive, expecting the rebels to emerge to protect civilian targets. James orchestrated a complex series of maneuvers. Strike teams moved through hidden tunnels and crystal formations, positioning themselves not to defend, but to attack. The Queen watched in amazement as James coordinated everything from the command center, going without sleep or rest. He seemed to be everywhere at once, adjusting plans, responding to changes, pushing himself and everyone around him to their absolute limits. The breaking point came during the 28th hour of continuous operations. James was organizing another strike when his legs suddenly gave out. The Queen caught him before he could fall. "Enough," she said firmly. "You cannot help anyone if you collapse." "Can't stop," he muttered, trying to stand. "Have to finish this. Have to make it right." "James," she said softly, using his name in the same tone he often used with her. "You are not on New Eden. We are not bound by old protocols or rigid thinking. You've taught us that." She helped him to a chair. "Let us show you what we've learned." For a moment, he looked like he would argue. Then, slowly he nodded. "Stone," he called out. "You take command of the next phase. Remember what we practiced." Stone straightened, his antenna lifting proudly. "We remember everything you taught us, James. Rest now. Let us handle this part." The Queen stayed with James as he finally allowed himself to rest. She watched with pride as her commanders implemented his strategies, adding their own adaptations and innovations. They had learned well from their human teacher, not just his tactics, but his way of thinking, his ability to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. "They're ready," James said quietly, watching the tactical displays through half-closed eyes. "They don't need me anymore." "They will always need you," the Queen corrected him, but not as a commander giving orders, as the one who showed them a new way to fight, a new way to think. She touched his shoulder gently with one crystalline hand. "You've done more than save us, James. You've transformed us." He was quiet for a long moment, watching as another of his carefully laid plans unfolded successfully. "Maybe," he said finally, "or maybe I just helped you find something that was already there." He straightened in his chair, some of his strength returning. "How long was I out?" 3 hours, she replied. "Long enough for the enemy to think they had us on the run. Long enough for the final pieces to move into position." James nodded, studying the tactical displays with renewed focus. "Then it's time for the last act." He stood, steadier now, ready to show your cousin what a real ruler looks like. The Queen's antenna lifted in what he had learned was her version of a smile, ready to show him what happens when you underestimate both humans and your own people. Together, they turned to face the tactical display, where the largest gambit of their campaign was about to begin. The next few hours would determine everything: victory or defeat, survival or extinction, the future of the Crystal Hive and all its people. And somewhere in James's mind, the ghosts of New Eden began to fade, replaced by the hope of redemption. The rebel stronghold loomed before them, its crystalline towers reaching into the purple sky. James crouched behind a formation of rocks, studying the fortress through his binoculars. 6 months of warfare had led to this moment. Beside him, Queen Silver's wings trembled slightly in the cold wind. "The intel was right," he said quietly. "Your cousin got scared enough to recall most of his forces to defend the capital. The Steel Hive troops are gone." He lowered the binoculars and turned to the strike team assembled around them. "You all know the plan. Everyone clear on their roles?" Stone nodded, checking his modified weapon. Crystal clear. The old warrior had developed a taste for human humor over the past months. "Teams are in position. The underground resistance is ready." The Queen touched the simple combat armor she now wore, similar to her guard's equipment rather than her traditional royal garments. "Time to end this, one way or another." James did one final check of his gear. The plan was audacious, perhaps even foolish, but those had become their specialty. While the enemy expected them to launch a massive attack to take advantage of the reduced defenses, they would instead slip inside using the ancient tunnels that honeycomb the Crystal Mountains. "Remember," James said as they prepared to move, "we're not here to win a battle. We're here to end the war." They moved through the darkness of the maintenance tunnels, following paths that hadn't seen use in generations. James had spent weeks studying old mining records, piecing together forgotten routes that led right into the heart of the fortress. The resistance movement inside the capital had helped map out guard patrols and security systems. The first part of their plan worked perfectly. Small teams of loyal guards created diversions at different points around the fortress, drawing attention and resources away from their true objective. By the time they reached the central levels, alarms were blaring throughout the complex, but for all the wrong reasons. "Junction ahead," Leaf whispered, scouting forward. "Heavy security doors, but they're operating on emergency power due to the attacks outside. We can slice through them." James nodded, but something felt wrong. He held up his hand, signaling everyone to stop. Years of combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts. "It's too easy," he muttered. "They should have guards here. Emergency protocols." "James," the Queen said suddenly, her antenna twitching. "Listen." In the silence, they could hear a faint humming coming from behind the security doors. James's eyes widened as he recognized the sound. Everyone back. Now. They barely made it around the corner before the doors exploded outward, filling the corridor with deadly shrapnel. Through the smoke, armored figures emerged, elite guards wearing the colors of both the rebel forces and the Steel Hive. "Welcome home, dear cousin," a voice called out. The smoke cleared to reveal a tall figure in ornate battle armor. The Queen's cousin, the architect of the rebellion, stepped forward. "I must admit, you've led us on quite a chase. You and your human pet." James signaled the team to hold position as he assessed the situation. They were pinned down, but he planned for this. Stone's team should be in position above them by now, ready to strike from the maintenance levels. All they needed was time. "Bold of you to face us yourself," the Queen replied to her cousin. "I thought you preferred to hide behind others while they did your killing." The rebel leader laughed. "I learned from watching your humans' tactics. Sometimes a leader must take direct action." He gestured to his guards. "Though I brought enough friends to ensure this ends properly." "Did you?" James called out, drawing attention to himself. "Did you bring enough? Because from where I'm standing, you look scared. Scared of what we've accomplished. Scared of how many of your own people have turned against you. Scared." The rebel leader snarled. "I have the fortress. I have the army. I have victory." "No," the Queen said firmly. "You have an illusion. You think fear and force make you strong. But I've learned what true strength is." She stepped forward, her wings spreading. "I've learned it from watching a single human stand against impossible odds. From seeing how loyalty freely given is stronger than any forced obedience." James used their conversation to signal the other teams using hand gestures he taught them. Everything was in position. Now they just needed the right moment. The rebel leader raised his weapon. "Enough talk. I offered you a chance to surrender before. Now you'll." The explosion from above cut him off. Stone's team burst through the ceiling panels, dropping smoke generators and sonic disruptors. In the chaos that followed, James's training proved its worth. The strike team moved like shadows through the smoke, using the confined space to their advantage, just as they'd practiced countless times. The rebel guards found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't see clearly, couldn't predict. Every tactic they tried was countered before they could execute it. James had trained his people to think 3 steps ahead, to fight not just with weapons, but with strategy and deception. Through the combat, James kept his focus on the rebel leader. The Queen's cousin was a skilled warrior, but he had never faced anything like human combat techniques. He was used to the formal, ritualized combat of hive warfare. This close quarters, no rules fighting style threw him completely off balance. "Your guards are pretty good," James said as he deflected a strike from the rebel leader. "But they're fighting the last war. We're fighting the next one." He moved in close, using techniques that had never been seen in hive combat before. The rebel leader's expensive armor proved less useful than he'd expected in such close quarters. The Queen fought alongside her guards, showing the same skill and determination she'd developed over months of training. She was no longer the helpless ruler James had rescued from the trading station. She had become a warrior in her own right. The battle reached its climax when James finally maneuvered the rebel leader into position. It wasn't skill or strength that won the day, it was psychology. James had studied his enemy, learned his patterns, his pride, his expectations. When the killing blow came, it was from a direction the rebel never thought to defend. From the Queen herself. "Surrender," she commanded as her cousin fell to his knees, disarmed and defeated. "End this now, before more blood is shed." The rebel leader looked up at her, then at James, finally understanding what he failed to see before. "You've changed," he said to his cousin. "You're not the same weak ruler I sought to replace." "No," she agreed. "I'm stronger now, strong enough to show mercy, if you're wise enough to accept it." The fight went out of the remaining rebel guards when their leader surrendered. Within hours, word spread throughout the hive. The war that had seemed unwinnable 6 months ago had ended in a decisive victory for the true Queen. Later, as the sun set over the crystal towers, James stood on a balcony overlooking the capital. The Queen found him there, watching as life began returning to normal in the streets below. "The Steel Hive representatives are retreating," she told him. "Without my cousin's promises of mining rights, they have no reason to stay. And after seeing how we fought, they're not eager to risk another conflict." James nodded, still watching the city. "Your people are adaptable. They'll rebuild quickly. Thanks to you." She moved to stand beside him. "The Council has asked me to establish a new military training program. They want our warriors to learn what you taught us, not just the tactics, but the way of thinking." "They don't need me for that," James replied. "You've already got some excellent teachers." He turned to face her. "Stone, Leaf, all of them. They understand the principles now. They'll develop their own styles, their own innovations." The Queen's antenna moved thoughtfully. "And you? Will you leave now that the war is over?" James was quiet for a moment, looking out over the city he had helped save. Finally, he smiled slightly. "Actually, I was thinking of sticking around. Someone needs to keep an eye on things. Make sure you don't forget everything I taught you about expecting the unexpected." "Is that the only reason?" she asked, her crystalline form catching the last rays of sunlight. "No," he admitted. "Maybe I've finally found a place where I can do more than just fight wars. Maybe I found somewhere I can help prevent them." He turned to her. "If you'll have me, of course." The Queen's antenna lifted in what he now knew was a smile. "James of Earth, you will always have a place here. Not just as a warrior or teacher, but as the one who showed us a better way." She gestured to the city below. "Besides, who knows what other impossible things we might accomplish together." James looked out at the crystal towers gleaming in the twilight, at the city beginning its recovery, at the people learning to think in new ways. "Who knows?" he agreed. "After all, Impossible just means no one's figured out how to do it yet. And in the gathering darkness, human and alien stood together, watching the start of something entirely new.